Hello and welcome back to another oral history of Team Lightning. I do kind of want to call this part 2, but calling it part 2 doesn't really feel fitting since they're not really in parts necessarily. Today we're going to go over geography. Like I promised in the last episode, I'd show you more what the world looks like. And I also have quite a bit to talk about so you can understand everything. Let me go ahead and turn that back on. So let's get right into it. First of all, we are going to have here Delta 1001, which is our current Delta / Alpha. Now, big picture looking at this, we're going to have kind of confusingly, so bigger picture, we have these really big shells, essentially. So for right now, I guess we're just gonna do like an oval. We'll just draw it like that. So this will just we'll just call this shell 1. So essentially, best way I can explain this. So you know the white heart and the black heart. The white heart is the light, black heart is darkness. Well, along with their godly forms, there's actual physical like objects that are separate from them, but they kind of do the same role. So the white heart, the physical white heart, essentially controls not reality and allows you to create stuff from not reality. The physical black heart, much like the darkness, has the ability to destroy something and then move it. So what happens is there is this black heart that exists inside of Fool's Fate Mountain, which you might remember from a previous prophecy, Fool's Fate Mountain. And it's made of really concentrated not reality. And when this not reality is kind of concentrated into itself, we call it either not reality black or we call it not reality squared. Both of those terms are used. And essentially there's this giant pulsating kind of like ball of, not reality black / not reality squared that exists inside of Fool's Fate Mountain. And you have to have a really, strong weapon to pierce it. And when you pierce it, all this not reality spills out and essentially destroys that shell. So if we start off with just shell 1, and the, person inside of shell 1 goes ahead and they destroy it, then they're going to go ahead and they're going to create, shell 1's going to get destroyed, so we'll just call this, and then 2 more shells are created, shell 2, and then in this case, the next one up would be shell 3. So now we also have shell 3. Now, let's say, for instance, shell 3 was then destroyed. The black heart inside of shell 3 was destroyed. Shell 3 would then be destroyed, and in its place would be the original shell 1, and then after it, we would get shell 4. So now here we have shell 4. And now we have all of these shells, and now let's say shell 2 is destroyed. Well, this is where it starts confusing. Shell 2 is going to become shell 3, and now ahead of shell 4, we are going to get shell 5. And essentially, each of these shells are like clones of each other with very small, minimal differences. And the point of this is to ensure that the civilization won't be destroyed, essentially, until the Souls of Oblivion. Now, the people who chase after these shells and destroy them, they're known as the Heart Incarnates. And basically their job is to kind of be drawn towards these shells and destroy them. And that's an entirely different fate number. I think it's like 1,000 something. Means you're a Heart Incarnate. And Heart Incarnates have this kind of latent ability that's really strong. They also usually get the Zero Saber. Usually, most of these Heart Incarnates end up with the Zero Saber. We'll get into that in later, because that's more towards Arc 5 and stuff that you start dealing with Heart Incarnates. But for right now, it's all you need to understand. So all of these create shells. The other things you need to understand is that all of these shells exist at the same time. So even if a shell isn't present in our reality, their timeline is still continuing along the same space. So even if shell 1's destroyed, technically, its timeline will still keep on going until it's brought back into our reality, if that makes sense. So currently, it doesn't look like this. It looks kind of currently, there's just a lot of shells. And the only way to get from shell to shell, this is where we start getting the sub-shell theory. Now, Team Lightning exists in either inside of shell 1 or shell 5. So one of these two. Not exactly sure which. Yeah, just take that however you will. And I'm pretty sure within the context of all the shells like lined up, I guess technically they're at infinity, right? Because they all exist at the same time. Which ones are currently in reality seems kind of meaningless in a sense. It's that they all just exist in kind of... I don't think there is infinity though. Here's the interesting thing. There's an entire... So, Team Lightning, there's Team Lightning, then there's Legends of Lightning, which is like kind of sort of made up lore. So the majority of Team Lightning is like set in stone lore. Legends of Lightning is more like wishy-washy lore. And then there's theory crafting, which is literally just theorizing how certain things work. And that's like an entirely different, you know, field of whatever you want. So a lot of stuff in later arcs and even now is kind of either falls into Legends, which is wishy-washy lore, or it falls into theory, which literally means we're theorizing. So currently, we have no clue if Team Lightning takes place in Shell 1 or Shell 5. We have no clue how many shells there are. Like I said, if I was theorizing, what I would say is there's probably a set amount of shells based on, you know, like it's predetermined up until the Solace of Oblivion, obviously. That's my current theory. So we have all these shells. So we're going to go inside of either Shell 1 or Shell 5. Oh yeah, so sub-shell theory. So we're going to get into it, but every single shell has certain ways between it. So essentially, travel between these shells are instantaneous. So even though there's space between these, it's basically not reality between all of them. It's just not measurable. So if you were to go from Shell 3, you would just immediately hop over to Shell 1. And you always go to the right. So you go from Shell 3 to Shell 1 to Shell 4 to Shell 5, and then if this was the last shell in the sequence, you would go all the way back to Shell 3. But of course, in order to travel from shell to shell, you don't actually have to destroy them. You just have to kill the heart incarnate of that shell, because there's one heart incarnate per shell. And then when you kill the heart incarnate, you go to the next shell, and then a new heart incarnate is chosen in the previous shell, if that makes sense. And there can be more than one heart incarnate at a time, so I shouldn't say a new one is chosen, but usually there's one, so when they die, a new one has to be chosen. And like I said, a person can have the fate number for heart incarnate and have like a bunch of other fate numbers, like we went over. So now I'm just going to call this Delta 1001. So now we're going to go ahead, we're going to get a new drawing. Where is drawings? There we go. Alright, so now we're going to call this either Shell 1 or Shell 5. Shell 1 or Shell 5. And it doesn't need to be exactly in the middle, we'll just put it right about there. So this is one of those. Let's go ahead and let's draw out our oval. Looks a little something like this. Very cool, very cool. Oh, well, that's like really big. Can we make this like... You know what? We're not going to go with the big oval because I don't know how that's going to work. Let's just delete this. Let's go ahead. Let's get some more shapes. So within Shell 1 or Shell 5, we have Light Dimension Major. We have the Null Sector, which, if you guys don't remember, is the 255 failed dimensions. So the reason why we say this is either Shell 1 or Shell 5, but Shell 1 was the original. And once Shell 1 was complete, that shell was then copied to all the other shells. We don't know if our main story of Team Lightning takes place inside of that original shell, because that can be assumed because the light and the darkness both have investment in that shell. The light, you know, the light dimension technically exists in all of them, but the dark dimension only exists in Shell 1. So it kind of makes sense that it would exist in Shell 1, because the darkness has so much, you know, and the light both has so much investment in that shell. But it could also be in Shell 5, because we'll learn later in Arc 5 and stuff, based on the way the shells were, like, destroyed and stuff, it should take place in Shell 5, if that makes sense. But it makes more sense for it to be Shell 1. Like I said, we'll get into that much, much later. So I'd like to mention Major, we have the Null Sector, which, like I said, is a 255 failed dimensions, and then we also have Not Reality existing somewhere over here. So Not Reality, or NR. existing somewhere over here. The size doesn't really matter. Now, between these, like I said before, between these, I probably should have added this line, travel is just instantaneous. So you can travel to whatever from wherever, and travel between them is quite literally instantaneous. How do you spell, is it like that? I don't think that's it. Yeah, no, that's not it. Instantaneous, cool. Once we get into some of them, so space between them, once again, doesn't technically exist. In order to breach these shells, so they have these really kind of thin paracausal / not reality borders on them, and you need like a really strong object to pierce through them. Less strong than what you need to destroy the Blackheart. So if I was just to say off the top of my head, I'd probably say like 20 mores to pierce the shell, and probably around like 30 to destroy the Blackheart, somewhere along those lines. It's less about power at that point and more about your fate, whether or not you're fated to go between them, and about willpower and stuff. Like, your actual power at that point is gonna just come as a result of whether or not you're supposed to go between them. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna call this shell 1 or 5. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to draw up Light Dimension Major. We will go over the Null Sector later. That's more like Arc 2 and stuff is really big into the Null Sector, and Arc 3 and Arc 4 are really big into the Null Sector. And that has its own entire history, which we'll get into. I might sprinkle some lore from it here and there. So next up, we are going to have, this is going to be Light Dimension Major. And Not Reality doesn't really have any geography, because it's just, you know, not reality. So we have Light Dimension Major. Now within Light Dimension Major, we are going to go ahead and we are going to have the Light Dimension. I should also clarify that this is Light Dimension Major before the First Great War, or the Light and Darkness War, or whatever war you want to call it. It was just the big war, you know, so just the Great War, just I guess kind of rip off World War I. So we have Light Dimension Minor. And again, these sizes are not meant to be actually what they look like. It's just, they're huge, like obviously, they're entire dimensions. This is Dark Dimension. And between these, before the First Great War, which we'll get over what happened after the First Great War, travel is just hunky-dory between these two. Now, next up, we are going to have the Demon Isles down here. So how you do Isles? It's not yelling at me, so I guess we're okay. Now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to draw a line between these. As you can see right here, we have the Demon Isles. That really doesn't seem right. I don't know. It just doesn't seem okay to me. Is that really how you do it? It's crazy. Let's actually move this over here so we have some room up here. That looks good. Oh, that's not look good. That's fine. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to draw up next things. This is a lot of things. So they're all technically together, but within here we have the Land of the Dead / Realm of the Gods. Gods probably capitalized. / the Energy Kingdom, which we'll get into when we talk about energy. So now let's go ahead, let's draw a line between these, because travel between these is all hunky-dory right now, which like I said will completely change later. So, travel between these still is instantaneous. Still the space between these, because you were still talking on the dimensional scale. I know we've gone through multiple maps, but within like our reality, these are still entire dimensions, which is like crazy to think about. And like I said, we will get into all of these a little bit later. Next, we're going to go into Light Dimension Minor. So travel between these two, there's essentially, you know, no, we'll get into that. We're going to call this Light Dimension. Actually, we can just copy this entire text. My only hesitation now that I'm doing this time about geography is a lot of this, a lot of it just isn't going to be worth going into detail right now until we get more into it. It's like the Null Sector is going to be worth going into detail, the Demon Isles and Dark Dimension isn't really going to be worth going into detail. more until we get to where it's important, because right now I'm just going to be giving you this, and it really won't mean anything to you. Well, that's big, so let's make that tinier. So now within this, we have Camelot. Which is over here, right about. Wait, no. Is Camelot Milky Way swapped? Hold on. Yeah, no, Camelot's supposed to be over there. What am I doing? Camelot's over here. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to do done. We also have Milky Way. Yep, Milky Way we all know and love. It's going to be hanging out over here. Okay, next up we have, let's see if I can do this from memory. Doomsk. Should be like that, right? I want to say. That's how you do it. Hold on. NMB. That's what I was forgetting. DMSC NMB, which by the way, this is Clom language, which is Clom is also their word for alien too, which we will get to their language actually pretty soon. So next episode after this is either going to be on energy, or we're going to be talking about the couple of the alien races, and maybe get into the start of the First Great War, and then we're going to have a really long episode dedicated to the First Great War. Might split it up into a two-parter, all things considering. Yeah. Something like that. You can come up with your own pronunciation, honestly. I don't really care if you want to come up with your own funny way of saying it. And then again, not exactly accurate to size. Over here we have the alien sectors where all the alien species live. Dun 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 dun. And then we'll just say like this is do not have much room. Let's make all of these a bit tinier. So yeah, like I said, I hope I can get through all the way to the start of the books, giving you like a lot of good information. Like I'm not going to be trying to skimp too much. I'll try to give you all the information that's relevant to the start of Arc 1, and hopefully we can get through that in a few episodes. That's my hope. And then, like I said, we'll see from then on if I want to continue with the series. Or even if I don't think I particularly care if anybody's watching. I'm really glad if you're watching, but even if it's just for me, this is just cool to be out there. So we have the alien sectors, and we're going to do this, and we're going to say this. Why does it look weird? Whatever. We're going to say the dark dimension is right over here. Cool. So this is light dimension minor. And we will get into more detail on what Camelot and the Milky Way and the alien sectors alien sectors will get into more detail with like the Blood and Rust Wars and the Energy Wars and stuff. For the First Great War, we'll get into more detail about what Camelot and the Milky Way look. Kind of. We're just going to talk about a few of the key planets. So within Camelot and the Milky Way, there's like somewhere like a little over 30 planets in Camelot and 25 planets in the Milky Way. So the way planets work is it has to be habitable, it has to be like the Goldilocks zone, and then we have this really big terraforming machine we do to make it, worthwhile to live on. But even then, most planets, at the current point in Team Lightning when the First Great War starts, it'll be the year 12,000 AE, which is 12,000 years after Earth was destroyed, so there's a lot of time for these planets to be terraformed for populations to grow on them. But as you'll see, the First Great War has a really big toll on the landscape of everything. Even Light Dimension Major has it takes place over the entirety of Light Dimension Major. It'll change the landscape quite drastically. And that landscape is going to be where we're going to be spending the majority of our time. So I think it's going to be more worthwhile to go over that landscape in more detail. But this is essentially, and of course, travel between these takes time, of course. There is also, just for future reference, will come up in a later arc, when we do another text box. Over here, we know that there is another dimension, or another galaxy. So we'll just say a sixth galaxy being worked on by Project Silence. Not spelled silence correctly. So Project Silence, essentially, and so we'll get more into how energy works later. One of the things you can do with energy is you can create a portal out of energy. And you need quite a bit to do it, but after a lot of advancements in science, we were able to create these, like, rings. What they would do is they would spin really, really fast, and by combining them with people who could control energy, they were able to kind of put their, like, you know, abilities into the rings, and the rings could kind of catch energy when they spun really fast, and they also had memory built into them. So the way a portal works is you can only portal to somewhere you've been before. So these rings would spin really fast, create a portal, you know, the ship would have to be moving really fast and create a portal in front of it, and wham, you'd go through the portal and you end up in somewhere you've been before. So the goal of Project Silence was this sixth galaxy was so far away that there was no way to get to it, like easily. So they made this gigantic ship, and also travel between these takes forever too. The fastest way to get between them is through portaling. And that's why, you know, you want to buy rings that have a lot of memory pre-programmed into them, so that way you can get around much easier, if that makes sense. So the more memory a ring has programmed into it, the more expensive it is. But most rings have the ability to travel between these two, mainly. Dumsknum and Dumskboob are both uninhabitable. There's no planets in them that are habitable. There's some alien species living in them, and a lot of, like, outlaws and stuff like to live in these planets. But they live on, like, you know, self-sustaining, like, asteroid belts and stuff. They don't actually have a planet they can call home, and very few people live in them. There are also stages a lot of times, like, during wars and stuff, people will, like, hide out in here. But for the most part, it's not really habited by anybody. So yeah, Project Silence, so they were going out to find that dimension, and essentially what they would do is they would pack a bunch of people onto the ship, and they would send it out, and those people would spend their entire lifetimes on the ship. And once they got out as far as they could, the ring would the ring would remember, it would record where it was. They'd portal back to, like, the Milky Way or something, and all the people on the ship would get off, a new generation would get on, they'd teleport, you know, they'd portal to where the last, you know, generation got off, and they would keep on going forward, until eventually we got to the sixth galaxy. But once we got there once, we could just keep on sending rings there to gather history of it. But once we get to the sixth galaxy, we're going to discover an alien species we might not like, which will be in a later arc. It's part of Arc 2 and is a bigger deal in Arc 4. So we'll get into that later, Project Silence. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this kind of brief look at, you know, all of our different places here. Delta 1001, Shell 105, Light Dimension Major, Light Dimension Minor. And I hope this gives you a slightly better idea of how big our world is. So, for the most part, we are going to be focusing on just Light Dimension Minor. For, like, the good majority of, like, everything. Even the Null Sector and stuff doesn't come up till Arc 2. So, for right now, we're going to be spending the majority of our time in Light Dimension Minor. We'll be going into more, Light Dimension Major, sorry. We'll be spending the majority of our time here, and of course, a lot of time in Light Dimension Minor. And we'll go over that more later. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.